Today in our special series, Road to $5 trillion Economy, I have the pleasure of speaking with a person who's been at the epicenter of the 1991 economic crisis and the reform process that followed. Decisions taken then fundamentally changed the way the Indian economy functions. Today, India faces a slowdown and has set a target of achieving a $5 trillion economy by 2024. So how achievable is this target? Joining us now in this special series is Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. Mr. Ahluwalia, thank you so much for joining us. Let me begin by asking you where you think we are placed right now. We're in the middle of an economic slowdown and are seeing a slew of measures being taken to tackle this. Given this, do you think we're well on our way to reach this $5 trillion target?
No, I think if you're focusing on the $5 trillion economy target, that's actually not very different from a real growth of, say, 8% per year. So your question is, are we on track for a real growth of 8% per year? And I think the short answer is we're not. The good news is that we've done it before. I mean, before the great global financial crisis, the economy grew more than 8%. So it's not that India can't do it. But right now, I think we would be wrong in not accepting that we are not anywhere near on track for an 8% growth. Now, opinions vary on how bad the situation is. The RBI, for example, very recently put out a growth forecast of 6.9%. That, to my mind, is much higher than what anyone else is saying. Most people are putting it somewhere around 6 plus, and some are actually putting it lower than that. So the real question is, can we get over this definite slump and get back to 8%, and how quickly? I think, the long run capability of the economy is definitely there. But, you've got to address some of the reasons why the growth has slowed down. And they're not, I think, to do with just a little bit of tinkering here and there. I mean, we've had a major decline in private investment, which has to be revived. Agriculture is not doing well. Employment has been a problem. And without employment, you don't have the demand to get private investment to go up again. And, exports have been doing very, very badly. I don't think there's any known case of an economy reaching 8% growth and not having a significant improvement in its export performance. And I would say that in the last 4 or 5 years, our exports are virtually stagnant. Now, it's true that the world economy has not been growing too rapidly, but we're doing much worse than other countries. Bangladesh and Vietnam, many such countries have done a much better job of export promotion. So what we need is address these issues. Why is there a problem in agriculture, and what's the source of rural distress? How do we get investment going? What should be the priority for the government as far as CapEx is concerned? I would say that clearly is infrastructure. And how do you get private investment revived? A lot of that is connected at the moment with lack of demand. Profitability of Indian companies is slowly going down. And unless that goes up, you're not going to see a revival in investment either. Nor is it the case, quite honestly, that we can just switch from a private sector-led investment strategy and go for a public sector-led investment strategy. We've done that before. There are areas where the public sector should be doing a lot more, and those are really the infrastructure areas. Now, linked to all this is what's happening on the fiscal deficit. And there, quite frankly, there are real concerns that have been brought out by many analysts. The fiscal deficit, as reported, does not seem to reflect the reality. The CAG very recently, talking about the situation a couple of years ago, mentioned the point that we seem to be accumulating off-balance sheet liabilities which are not reflected in the fiscal deficit. For this year's budget, we have built in a growth rate of revenues which just doesn't reflect the fact that last year, that is the year that ended in March 2019, the growth of revenues was much below what was being projected. So if you look at what is projected for today, using the revised estimate figures for the last year, that doesn't look so unreasonable. But if you go to the actuals, it's absolutely impossible. Now, a related issue is that last year, revenues didn't grow, but nevertheless, the fiscal deficit came out more or less as projected. Now, this can only mean that, expenditures that had been committed just weren't made. Now, that often happens. The governments hold back expenditure. But, if that means there's a huge pile-up of expenditure that has to be made now, which was sort of committed last year. In which case, what happens to the new expenditure, which is built into the current year's budget? So I think these are huge uncertainties about the fiscal deficit. And if you combine that with poor export performance, I think you have a diagnostic of lots of problems. I'm not saying that we can't address them, but we need to lay out a whole a strategy for addressing them, which is done holistically. I mean, it should ideally have been done in this budget, the budget that's just over, but it wasn't, and that's a pity.
Now, Mr. Ahluwalia, you've had a ringside view and been a part of the core team that tackled the economic crisis we saw before the huge decisions in 1991. In fact, the 1990 paper you put out is still talked about as laying the groundwork. How would you compare the current situation to what we saw then?
I think in 91, the crisis was much more immediate. I mean, the economy was in a weaker position. And, the external reaction to India's weakness emerged very quickly during 1990. And by the time the Narasimha Rao government took office in 1991, foreign exchange reserves had dropped to very, very low levels. And it was clear that we had to do something. So the crisis was upon us. We had to manage it. We're lucky that the government consciously did more than just manage a crisis. I've said this on many occasions, that if all we had done was to manage the crisis was over in 2 years. And we could have gone back to chugging along at 5-6% growth. But we used the crisis as an opportunity to do a lot of longer term reforms, and that's always the thing to do. Now, the difference this time around is that, while I think there are some serious problems, we're not in the same kind of crisis situation. And for example, we have a very substantial volume of reserves. So there's no immediate crisis over there. But, if the question is, are we simply saying there's no crisis? Or are we saying, are we well set for 8% growth? We are not well set for 8% growth. And therefore, the shortfall from that target should create a sense of urgency. And we ought to get on with laying out what we're going to do in order to achieve that objective. Because let me say that the objective is very important. I mean, the term $5 trillion economy has become a sort of a buzzword. It's just another way of saying 8% growth. Because you're going to get $5 trillion, if not in 5 years, you'll certainly get it in 7 or 8 years. So it's not as if $5 trillion is crucial. It's the 8% growth which is going to bring about the kind of employment generation which we absolutely need if we are going to provide gainful employment to our labor force. And I think on the employment front, we really do have a crisis, because the rates of unemployment that are being thrown up haven't been seen in decades. So, this is a powder keg we are sitting on. If we could be sure that we are triggering a return back to 8%, then we could say, yes, we're going to take care of that problem. If we're not sure about that, we're really kicking the can down the road, and we'll see major problems later. So that's the most serious part of it. I think the other serious part of questioning the 8% target is that we don't seem to be doing what is necessary to make the Indian economy competitive, and that's reflected in our very poor export performance. Sometimes to make the economy competitive, you have to sort of open up. And I think that's a major reversal of signals that has taken place in the last 2 or 3 years, raising protective duties on all kinds of items. I mean, from 91 onwards, through the Narasimha Rao government to the United Front government, the Vajpayee government, and also the UPA government, there was a steady reduction in the external, the customs duty rates, making the economy more open. Now, I think for the first time in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen that reverse itself. And you're going to see the same, the issue will come up when, for example, the discussions to join RCEP take place in November. I mean, already you hear mutterings of complaint that, we cannot afford to lower duties because we become uncompetitive. Now, actually, the lowering of duties, if you join a free trade agreement like that, takes place over many years. It doesn't happen immediately. And there's no reason why we can't identify what is it that is making us uncompetitive and put in an 18-month program to change that. So I think if we could see more action on those fronts, you would actually see a serious revival of investment interest in India. I mean, India should be a base for many people who are otherwise likely to move out of China to locate their Asian facilities in India and use it to service the rest of the world. Now, to do that, we have to integrate with the Asian region. So let's see what happens in RCEP.
So what is your reading and assessment on the measures that the current government is taking so far? We've had a series of announcements from the finance minister, the latest important one being lowering of corporate tax rates. It's a long-standing demand. Do you think these measures are rightly assessing the economic situation and providing the solutions that are needed right now?
Well, as you say, the reduction in the corporate tax rate is a change in the structure of taxation, which many people, including myself, think was quite sensible. In fact, I expected to see this in the budget. It should have been done in the budget, because then one could have said, look, this is what we're doing, this is the revenue loss, this is how the fiscal deficit is going to come out. So aligning India's corporate tax rates with Asian corporate tax rates, which is now the case, I think is a good measure. But it's not going to address some of the immediate problems which are worrying the economy. It's not going to address the very high level of unemployment right now. It's not going to address the dislocation that seems to have occurred in the informal sector, which is actually leading to some of the rural distress and some of the high unemployment. It's certainly not going to do anything for export growth. Most of the export come from much smaller companies. So I think it's structurally a move which one can say is in the right direction. As I say, it should have been done earlier. But I wouldn't say that it's something that you can call a reaction to the short-term problem at the moment, because the short-term problem is a lack of demand. I mean, that is why private investment is not taking place. That is why profitability in companies is going down, and we need to see what we can do there. So this tax relief will incentivize investment. It'll give some money back to the corporates, but it's not going to put money in the hands of those who are likely to generate demand straight away.
Of course. There's also the question of loss of revenue and its impact on the fiscal deficit. Are you concerned at all? Because there is a school of thought that says at a time of a slowdown in growth, it's okay to go a little easy on your fiscal deficit targets. Do you think this is an important concern?
One cannot disagree with the view that the fiscal deficit target should be a dynamic target, and if the economy slows down, then the fiscal deficit will increase anyway. I mean, when you have automatic stabilizers, that's what happens. I mean, nothing else changes, the economy is slowed down, the revenue growth is going to be less, so the fiscal deficit is going to increase. That's perfectly acceptable. Here, what you're doing actually is you're actually reducing taxes. Okay? So the loss of revenue is not due to the slowdown, it's a loss of revenue because you're consciously reducing the rate and thus accepting an increase in the fiscal deficit. Now, my main point about the fiscal deficit is that we need to be very clear about what it is. And quite frankly, the fiscal math is very fuzzy. There's been a lot of high-level criticism, even from the Comptroller and Auditor General, that we're not reporting the correct fiscal deficit. So frankly, I feel that we need to sit down and have a full disclosure that if we were to put all our commitments on the line, this is what the fiscal deficit looks like. And I think if the government is willing to make a case that, look, we can't reduce it this year, but we'll reduce it in the next 2 or 3 years in the following way, one could look at that. But right now, we're looking at numbers which just don't have any credibility, which every newspaper has more or less said. So, while I'm not in favor of rigid adherence to fiscal targets, especially not in a slowdown, I don't think that can be used to say it doesn't matter what the fiscal deficit impact is.
Now, you've spoken about the demand issue, and the demand side of it, that is the lack of consumption, is definitely a big problem. What is your prescription to encourage an increase in consumption and demand?
I think a lot of the reason why the oomph on demand has gone out of the system is the lagged effects of the demonetization in 2016. It was much more disruptive than people at that time were willing to admit. I don't think the government, even today, wants to admit that it was very disruptive. And they will say that there were all kinds of positive side effects. But the fact of the matter is it disrupted the flow of credit to the informal sector. And I think we just have to get that back. Now, exactly how that's to be done requires a lot of careful thinking about the role of banks. And unfortunately, fixing the banks was one of the top priorities even as early as 2015. It hasn't been done. We've gone through all kinds of different formulae, but nobody is right now in a position to say that the banks are actually able to support all kinds of economic activity. Now, it is also true, by the way, that there is a lot of liquidity. I mean, the chairman of the State Bank of India has said that I have lots of money and I'm willing to lend, but there are no takers. Now, part of the problem could well be that in that entire range of the informal sector, the disruption that was caused earlier because of the demonetization has left a number of people not creditworthy or owing money to banks which they're not able to repay. So how to get that credit moving is the real issue. At one stage it was thought that the NBFCs might be willing to do it. So actually the banks were lending to the NBFCs and the NBFCs were supposed to be lending onwards. But the NBFC crisis after IL&FS has also sort of put a stop to a lot of that activity. So we need a concerted look at what is holding things up. I'm not in a position to indicate exactly what we should do, but we need a strategy that will address that problem. And I think we're not, I don't find that strategy in any official document that I've seen.
So how do you think the Modi government has handled the economy so far, and what seems to be their outlook on handling the economy? How do you assess it?
Well, look, I think the correct way of looking at the UPA record is that we had an outstanding first 7 years when the average growth rate was something of the order of 8.4%. That had never been achieved in India for any length of time before. The last 3 years was a slowdown, which began in 2011 when there was a Eurozone crisis, so virtually every country slowed down. But I think we slowed down a lot more. There were internal constraints, and I think the UPA has been criticized for not having been able to handle those internal implementation problems. Although in the last year of the UPA, if you look at the latest statistics, in the last year of the UPA, the growth rate had begun to edge up. So, it had gone down from, I think, 6.7 to 5.3 and then 5.7 and then 6.1. So it was edging up. In the Modi period, I mean, again, in the early years, the growth rate looked as if it was reasonably healthy. But, you know, for the last 5 quarters, it has been steadily going down. And there's many questions have been raised by very knowledgeable people about the quality of the numbers. I mean, for example, you know, Arvind Subramaniam, who was the chief economic advisor until a year ago, I mean, he's produced some very interesting papers which say that there is a disconnect between the current official GDP growth rate and the kind of more micro level numbers that go to make up GDP growth. And he says that the growth rate is actually something like 2 to 2.5 percentage points lower than what the official numbers state. Now, I mean, this is not an official estimate, but, you know, to my mind, it's impossible to make an assessment of the last 5 or 6 years without taking a view on whether the GDP growth, for some reason, is being overestimated. I think most people feel, in terms of the feel-good factor, they do not think that the numbers that are there reflect the underlying reality. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't have the kind of slowdown we've seen in the manufacturing sector and in exports, and that's not reflected in the GDP growth. So I think that, you know, whoever in the government worries about these things should not be complacent and think that the RBI estimate of 6.9% growth reflects reality. I think it doesn't. What the underlying growth rate is, I'm not in a position to give a number. But my guess would be that, you know, we're not at the moment doing much better than 6% and could even be doing a little bit worse. Now, if at that time, at this time, if the underlying growth rate is that, and the target is to get back to 8%, then I'd like to see a very clear strategy of what's going to bring it there. And one has to accept that there are short-term dips, even some mistakes, but you can correct those and get back to a high growth trajectory. But what is it that you're going to do to raise investment, private investment? What are you going to do to improve exports? What are you going to do to improve the performance of the agricultural sector, which is quite crucial for demand, given the very large numbers of people still dependent on agriculture? So I don't think that we have a credible strategy to reach the $5 trillion number at the date that's being indicated. I mean, of course, even if we grow at 6%, we'll reach it in 10 years, if not in 5.
So my last question, what would be your top 3 priority areas which we need to focus on right now and develop a strategy to tackle the slowdown?
I think we do need to, I would emphasize the following. Agriculture. You know, we should have a strategy that will give us 4% growth of agriculture. Now, the government has talked about doubling farmers' incomes in 5 years, and that requires a growth rate of whatever, 12, 14%. That's not going to happen. So let's be realistic and say what in the next 4 or 5 years is a reasonable growth strategy. My guess is that 4% real GDP growth in agriculture would be a major achievement. It does require quite a lot of things that have to be done on the ground. A lot of them have to be done by state governments, not the central government. But then that's the job of the government, Niti Aayog, whoever, to try to evolve a consensus. I think we should have a list of policies which the central government can follow and a list of policies that the state governments can follow. And maybe the central government can give a lead by saying, well, look, it's going to do these things. Now, let me give you one controversial thing. I mean, for example, for years, economists have been saying that the fertilizer subsidy is dysfunctional and damaging. It leads to excessive use of urea, wasteful use of urea, and smuggling of urea into neighboring countries. Now, if we could just get rid of this subsidy over a 5-year period, or if not get rid of it, maybe reduce it by 2/3 and shift the resources thus realized into agriculture, both in terms of better resource management for water, more agricultural research. I think that would be a very good thing. But that's a central government strategy. I mean, the price of fertilizer is decided by the central government, and it's a very sensitive issue. It's not easy to do. And no government, none of the previous governments have done it. But you know, we cannot think that we're going to achieve great things and simply not be able to address some of these basic issues. I'll give you a second example. I think the central government should simply abolish the Essential Commodities Act. It's a completely outdated piece of legislation, but what it does is it gives the power to the states to impose all kinds of restrictions on anybody engaged in agricultural trade. Now, if you want to bring in the corporate sector into agricultural marketing, you're not going to do this as long as you have this sort of dysfunctional legislation. Then there are a whole lot of things that the state governments have to do. But you know, if the central government would do its bit, I think it would carry credibility. I would say that on exports, there has been talk that we will actively try to attract companies that have a base in China and that actually export to the global market, and more generally tool up our own industry to be able to compete in some of the relatively low technology areas which China is vacating, but which other countries are now moving into, like Bangladesh, Philippines, Vietnam. And I think the real exchange rate is a problem. Keeping the real exchange rate weak is a good idea from the point of view of export profitability. I would also say that as a signal of confidence that we are going to make Indian industry more competitive, we should join the RCEP agreement in November. That's a very simple decision. There will be opposition from within the government and from Indian industry, but we have to tell the people that the proposition that India cannot compete is totally inconsistent with the objective that we're going to become a $5 trillion economy. I mean, you cannot simultaneously say that we're going to achieve these things, but somehow or the other we can't compete. And remember, it's a very large grouping of the Asian region countries. Now, internationally, what's happening is the attitudes towards trade are weakening globally. Support for the WTO is going down. The United States is turning inwards. The one part of the world that isn't turning inward is Asia. And we need to be an integral part of this trading bloc. Now, if we don't do that, then we're missing on the big things and fiddling around at the margin.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ahluwalia, for sharing your thoughts with us. Some important inputs coming in there from a top economist and a figure key to the dream budget of 1991, especially when we're hoping for another set of bold reforms to match this. Thank you for joining us this evening on the India Development Debate. I'll see you back here tomorrow. Good night.